Welcome to Behind the Page, the Eli Marks podcast, with your hosts, John Gaspard and me, Jim Cunningham.
Jim, hello, Jim.
John, nice to see you. How you be?
I'm good. I'm great. Here we are already, episode 509. That means it's the 9th episode of the 5th season. And I got to thinking, just before I hit this record button, and maybe I should plan these things a little bit better. We're getting to that point in the season, maybe listeners don't know this, where we start planning the next season because your schedule in summer and fall is crowded, to say the least.
Yeah.
We try to get as much done, at least interview-wise, before you start running around a lot. So listeners may realize that a lot of our interviews are 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months old or more. We record things ahead of time, that things happen after we recorded. You know, we talked about Morgan and West, recorded that a while back, and then they broke up. And so we're talking about them in present tense, and they're not. A couple episodes ago, talked about the conversation with Gene Hackman. And after that was recorded, he passed away. So don't turn to us for the news, basically, is what I'm saying, because we're not up to date. But I am starting to think about, okay, we're going to be wrapping up our 5th season. What do we want to do moving forward? Do we want to keep doing the same thing? Do we want to try something new? What do we want to do? And so I'm opening this up to listeners to tell us.
I see where we're going now.
Thank you.
Did not know where we were going.
It's not in the notes. I just thought of this as we started, to tell us what they think, what they'd like. I mean, I've done surveys in the past. You know, do you want interviews and parts of the books? Do you want just parts of the books? Do you want just interviews? Blah, blah, blah. But let's dig a little deeper. So if you have some ideas on what you think season 6 and beyond should look like, if there is a season 6, let us know. Just go to jgaspard@earthlink.net. That's jgaspard@earthlink.net. If I remember, I'll put a link in the show notes. And just let us know where you think we should be heading, and just try to keep that language, appropriate.
Okay.
All right.
Well, these are good things. I think I enjoy always getting emails. I got one this morning from our friend Ken in New Jersey, who was tickled pink to let me know he found a copy of Spirit Theater with the record, which is hard to
Ooh.
find. He said he's been looking for it for a while, and it's one of the only Eugene Berger books he did not own. And in listening to the podcast, he said, I decided I needed to own it. And so now he does. So I get these emails, and I'm just tickled pink that people are listening and or responding or taking the time to let me know that they are impacted by this podcast in one way or another. It's a delight.
Okay, so I got to ask, what is the record that comes with Spirit Theater, and did you get that originally?
Yes, I did. The record that comes with it is a very flimsy, floppy kind of record that you would get with stuff like that. But it's Eugene doing the Ballad of the Harp Weaver. Yeah, and it's pretty cool. I wore my copy out. Both of the record and the book. So I have gotten a second copy that he signed for me fast, and said some very nice things. So I'm set, but I do miss that little record because it was cool to have. It's a great poem, and I use it because Eugene used it. I use it,
Yeah.
and it is a terrific poem for that kind of work. And I wish that I have changed the poem to because it's really a Christmas poem.
Mm-hmm.
And I just made some slight adjustments in the poem to make it fit a little differently into the Halloween show that I do. And I wish I had done that before Eugene, the patron saint of this podcast, had passed, because I would love to have said, hey, look what I did. What do you think? And have him either say, you're an idiot, or I'm like he does to other magicians, make mine like yours, which, he would do that on occasion with people.
Oh, wow. Well, for anyone who's doing the Eugene Berger drinking game, we're going to be quiet from this point on because you're probably near passing out, having the name mentioned as many times as was so early on. Anyway, we got to dive in here. We have a great interview today, even though it's
Fascinating
sort of
interview.
freaked you out. We're talking with magician and mathematician Brent Morris.
Maybe not in that order.
Yeah, probably mathematician, magician. It depends. He's retired now and might be
I
doing
don't
more
know.
magic than whatever.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
anyway, before we jumped into the interview, I had to first explain to him that the topic we were about to cover, math, was actually never supposed to be part of this podcast. I will say before we dive into our questions that there's two things that my co-host Jim has said consistently over the last 5 seasons. One is he has mentioned that when magic is a good, it's almost a spiritual experience. And the other thing he has said repeatedly is, I was told there would be no math.
Yes,
So
that's true.
we need to keep,
We need to keep this simple.
yes, we need to keep it simple. And I don't mean simple in the pejorative sense, but I just look
Simple
at
in
him.
the gym sense.
Yeah, just look at him. He's wearing a baseball cap in his kitchen. Come on.
Exactly.
So anyway, in a past interview, you mentioned watching the Howdy Doody show, and that as a child, that sparked your interest in magic. Do you remember what it was about that show or that magician or the particular trick that captivated you?
Well, it was Buffalo Bob, and Buffalo Bob was the MC of the Howdy Doody show. And I can remember as a kid from the house that I lived in, I must have been 5 or 6 years old. And the Howdy Doody show was the only kids show that was nationally broadcast. And I think at one point there was like a multiple year waiting list to get on the show. So so parents would give birth to a child, and then, within a week, request to have them on the show for their 5th birthday or something.
It's like signing them up for first grade when they're born.
Yes, very, very much like that. So, I watched the Howdy Doody show, and if I remember right, Buffalo Bob was with Zippy the monkey, and he brought out a chafing dish, which I now recognize as a dove pan, and he put some stuff in it, and then he put the lid on it, and then he took the lid off, and it was filled with popcorn. It was mounded with popcorn. It amazed me. So for every birthday and Christmas thereafter, I wanted a magic trick. When I went to the library, I would check out every book on magic, and I would read them. I'd learn how to do tricks, and of course, as a young magician, as soon as I learned how to do the secret, I would go show it to someone, which doesn't work very well. You really should practice it a lot. And then when I was about 8 years old, I decided I'd put on a magic show in the garage and make some money. And so we made signs that we put up on the telephone poles in the neighborhood, and we had folding chairs in the garage, and I had several of my friends and my sister were going to help me put on the show. We sold Kool-Aid and miniature donuts for refreshments. We made more money on the refreshments than we did on the attendance. And I said, "Wow, this is great." So I did 2 or 3 magic shows in the garage, and then when I was 12 years old, a friend of ours in the neighborhood, was having a birthday. She was a younger girl, my sister's age, so I would have been 12, she would have been 9, something like that, 9 or 10, and I did a magic show for her birthday party, and I made $5, I think. Wow, I was overwhelmed. I'm rolling in cash, and then I let it be known around the neighborhood that I was available for birthday parties, and I made a little more money, and I had some business cards printed. Actually, what my dad did is he had a print job, at his, business, and it was going to be on cardstock, and he had a, 2.5 by 3-inch blank piece that he wasn't going to use. When they trimmed the paper, that would be left over, so he laid it out for a, business card for me. So I went down to a neighborhood toy shop, and I went up to the owner, and I said, "Could I leave you a stack of these cards if anyone is ever looking for a magician?" And by word of mouth and by a little chutzpah, I started making money as a magician, and this was cool. As part of this, my dad went to the Salvation Army, and they had dozens of tail suits that people had given because they had stopped wearing tail suits or tailcoats and were wearing tuxedos. And so he worked out a deal with them that I would do a magic show one evening and entertain the men that they helped, and I would get a set of tails and a folding silk top hat from their inventory, and so now I had a costume to wear and a top hat, and, here I am.
Your dad sounds fantastic.
Oh, I could not have done it without him.
Yeah, as a father myself, I appreciate all of those little steps your dad took. That's great.
Yeah, he was my great supporter. He would drive me to magic shows, when I was performing, if it was the evening some distance away. Yeah, it worked out great, and so somewhere around junior year in high school, maybe senior year, so I'm 17 years old, I decided I wanted to learn more about card magic because all the guys at the club are doing card tricks. And so I got a copy of The Royal Road to Card Magic, it was a classic beginner's book, and I worked my way through it. And I learned a dozen or 20 tricks that were pretty good. And then when I showed that I was learning how to do the sleight of hand, when I'd go to a magic club meeting, the older magicians were more than happy to share with me. Not, there's this sort of unwritten rule that you don't casually share the way tricks work, especially with someone that might have only a casual interest. So the fact that I learned about it, they taught me more. And it was about at this time that a British computer scientist named Alex Elmsley did his research on the Pharaoh Shuffle. Now he's famous for his or the Elmsley count. But Elmsley also did this work with the Pharaoh Shuffle in the mathematics of it. And one of the things that he did is he showed that if you converted a number, a location in the deck into a binary number, that then gives you a sequence of Pharaoh shuffles to do. Now I'm going to get a little bit technical and geeky here, but I don't think it's too geeky.
Well, first, let me just say, for the non-magicians, what is a Pharaoh shuffle?
A Pharaoh shuffle is a perfect shuffle. You cut the deck, assuming it's a deck of 52, you cut it into 2 packets of 26, you butt the ends together, and then they interlace perfectly. And there are 2 ways you can do it. You can do it and leave the top card on top, or you can shuffle it and the top card is shuffled in to the second position.
Mhm.
So that gives you an out shuffle with the top card out and an in shuffle with the top card in. And that's, I think, fairly intuitive. Even if you can't do the perfect shuffle yourself, you can imagine the cards going together every other one. And then you can imagine doing it in such a way so the top card remains on top or the top card goes in one. Well, Elmsley realized that there's a fairly simple formula describing where the cards go. And if you do the out shuffle, in fact, first I've got to back up and tell you one change we're going to make. Non-mathematicians would call the top card 1, the second card 2, the third card 3. We're going to use, if you've ever been in a European elevator, the ground floor is 0. It's
Mhm.
not 1. In America, we number the floors from 1. Both work perfectly fine, as long as you know which one you're doing. Now, if you use the European numbering system so that the top card is 0, and then the next card down is 1, and the next card down is 2, then a Pharaoh shuffle takes the card in position P. So P stands for the position. So it could be position 3 or 4, whatever P equals. If you double it, that's where the card winds up. And if you think about it a little bit, it's not too hard to imagine. The card on top of the deck doing an out shuffle stays on top of the deck. So 0 stays at 0, 2 times 0 is 0. The card in position 1 now has a card between 1 and 0. So the card in position 1 has been pushed down to position 2. Well, 2 times 1 is 2. And then similarly throughout the deck, the card in position P goes to position 2 times P.
So let me just make sure I'm getting this.
One of us should, because I'm done. I'm out of the contest.
No, I think you're going to get it, Jim. So if you know what the value is of card number 13, when you've done the shuffle, that card is now in the 26th position.
That's right.
Okay, I got it then.
That's just simple math.
It's called modular arithmetic if the value is bigger than 26.
Mhm.
What happens to the card in position 34? Well, that goes to 68, but there are not 68 positions in the deck. I won't try to explain that without having a chalkboard in front of me or
Thank
something to show
God.
diagrams.
But I'm
Yeah.
guessing that you need to do some sort of subtraction at that point. There's a
Yeah,
value that you consistently subtract. It's like doing a magic square, sort of.
yes.
Okay.
Do you guys need me for this, or should I could just turn off I could mute my mic, because I don't think I'm going to be of much value.
Jim, you have a stack of laundry there. Why don't you sort your socks and Brent and I'll keep talking?
This is fascinating. But now I got to just back up for a second, because for those of us who are not Pharaoh shufflers, but rather are shufflers, a Pharaoh shuffle is much different than the sort of, if you're playing cards with your family shuffle.
You've probably seen people do something similar to a Pharaoh shuffle, and that is that they take the two halves of the cards, they butt them together, put a little pressure on it. Yeah, and then the cards go together every other one. And that's what a Pharaoh shuffle is, but it's very controlled.
Mhm.
And Elmsley showed that if I wanted to take the top card in the deck and I wanted to move it to some other position in the deck, position 7,
Mhm.
I would convert 7 into a binary number, which would be 111, and then I would, for each 1, I would do an in shuffle, and for each 0, I'd do an out shuffle. Now, this is just as computer science is starting to become hot stuff. This is 1967, 68, and being able to do binary arithmetic in my head, and converting to binary numbers is not a big deal now, but it was pretty hot stuff back in 67.
Yeah.
And then I could do a magic trick. And in fact, I showed up at the Magic Club and I did this. I had someone choose a card. I used straightforward sleight of hand and got it to the top of the deck. That's the beginning of dozens and dozens of magic tricks.
Mhm.
And then I would ask one of the members of the Magic Club, tell me where you'd like your card to wind up. And so they would say, well, I want it in position, whatever it is. I would do the conversion in my head. I would then do the 3 or 4 Pharaoh shuffles, and there would be their card. These were guys older than me that really had no idea what binary numbers were. And so binary numbers are just becoming important to computers. All of a sudden, Brent is not the young kid who's just joined the club and is just, working his way through Royal Road to card magic. He's doing this amazing stuff with Pharaoh shuffles. So it gave me sort of a position of prestige in the club.
Now, let me ask quickly here. When you say that you're doing a Pharaoh shuffle, for each one of those, are you actually doing it butting the two halves together, or have you developed a way that you can do it what looks like a normal shuffle, but you're really
No.
just interlacing?
There's some people who can do what's called a table Pharaoh, and that's where the two halves are face down on the table. Then you put the edges together, and it looks like you're riffling with your thumb, or you are riffling with your thumb, and you can get them to go every other one, and I can't do that.
So you are just doing the traditional butting the two heads together,
That's
and you're
right.
doing it 3 or 4 or 5, whatever number of times it is that you need to get the card to the position you've asked it that you want it to be at.
That's right.
Okay. All right. Now, I don't want to get too into the weeds here, but we probably already are. Jim's gone.
All I'm thinking
is
about
gone.
right now is, I wish I had a Dove pan full of popcorn, because I've got nothing else to add to this.
I'm guessing that in order for this to be really effective, you need a set of cards that are at a particularly mature or not mature state. You don't want the cards that Grandma's been using to play gin rummy with for 40 years, but is the cards coming right out of the shrink wrap, is that the best kind of card, or does it need to be worked a little bit?
Worked a little bit, I think, is better, but I would rather have straight out of the pack than an old deck.
Let's take a little leap here that we'll just see if we can get Jim's head to explode, which is
It's
really,
starting. It's too late.
yeah.
There's
So,
brain matter all over my kitchen.
all right. So you are, last I heard, you're the only person in the world with a PhD in card shuffling. Is that still true, or did someone creep up on you there and try to get that?
There's several others now that
There are
that
now.
have.
But at the time, you were the first one to do that. How did that come about, and what does that mean that you have a PhD in card shuffling?
And who the hell offers a PhD in card shuffling? What kind of colleges are these?
Well, I went to Duke University, so they're
So there's
not-
some prestige.
I've heard of
there.
that.
It's not a clown college, for
No.
sure.
Here's what I did: is I stretched the truth a little bit for showmanship. The question that I looked at, and a mathematical dissertation is always looking at some problem, and solving the problem is going to make an advance in our mathematical knowledge. And so the basic question is, if you have a deck of cards and you allow two operations, a shuffle and a cut, how well does that mix up the cards?
Mhm.
Now that's a very practical question for a
Mhm.
casino. Is this the way you would want your dealers to randomize the cards? Now, Percy Diaconis, who's a statistician at Stanford, he's a breathtaking magician, and he's also a breathtaking mathematician. He's just an amazing guy. Percy answered some similar questions, but the first question he asked is, what does it mean to be mixed up?
Mhm.
You know, if I've got a deck of cards and I take one card off the top and I put it on the bottom, well, the cards are now shuffled from what they originally were. They're different, but but they ain't very different if you're just going to take a card off the top and put it on the bottom. So, science writer at the New York Times, Gina Colada, and this is I think back in the 70s, was interviewing Percy and said, "So Percy, you figured out how many shuffles it takes to mix up the deck. What's the number?" He said, "Oh, it's 6.76." And Gina looked at him and said, "No, Percy, it's either 6 or it's 7. We're not, it's 6.76 isn't going to cut it with my readers." And so Percy said, "It's 7." And so if you got a deck of 52, you're doing, ordinary type of shuffling, 7 shuffles gets you sort of maximum randomization. The question I looked at is I didn't go into that level of detail, but I showed that the Pharaoh shuffle and a cut, and an arbitrary cut where you cut any amount of cards off the top and you put it to the bottom, that can generate every possible permutation of the deck, which means in some sense you can't do better than generating everything.
So are you saying that just those two moves are enough to sufficiently randomize the deck?
Yes, you can achieve any permutation.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Even I can follow that.
That was the question I looked at in my dissertation. And then I looked at an additional question. What if we took the deck of cards and we cut it into 3 packs? And I gave a third to Jim, a third to John, and Brent has a third. And we're sitting around the table. And I go first. I put down my first card face down on the table, and then John puts a card on top of it, and Jim puts a card on top of it. Then we do it again. And so what we're doing is a triple riffle shuffle. The deck is divided into 2 parts, but since we only have 2 hands, we can't do an effective triple shuffle. But if we share the work, if each of us takes a packet of cards, then we could get a triple shuffle. Well, what if we had the generalized shuffle? Now call this a generalized Pharaoh shuffle, where you're not cutting into two packs. You're cutting it into 3 or 4 or 5, or however many you want. How well does that mix up the deck? Does it make any difference? And so that those were the questions I looked at. How well does the Pharaoh shuffle and a cut of an arbitrary number of cards mix up the deck? And then let's generalize the Pharaoh shuffle and define it with multiple packets of cards. And as is so often the case, I built my dissertation on previous work. A mathematician named Solomon Galam, who was a Hopkins graduate, but his faculty position was at USC in LA. He answered the first question with the regular Pharaoh shuffle. And then I generalized it and looked at a generalized Pharaoh shuffle.
So with this PhD in card shuffling, you then make the leap to designing a computer memory system. How does that leap happen?
Well, here's the way the leap happens. I graduate from Duke, get my PhD, spent a year teaching at Duke while I looked for a job, and I took a job with the National Security Agency. And it turns out NSA is the largest employer of mathematicians in the United States. Bigger than Google, bigger than Microsoft, you name it, NSA has more mathematicians. And I didn't know that. First day of my job, I walk into the Office of Mathematical Research. My boss comes up to me and says, "Welcome on board. Here's your desk over here." We all usually go to lunch sometime between 11 and 1 and, the usual stuff. And he says, "And by the way, here's a paper that's just been published in the IEEE Transactions on Computers." IEEE is the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, and that's
Right.
that's a major professional group. And they published several journals, and there was this article entitled "Parallel Processing with the Perfect Shuffle." He said, "You know something about the perfect shuffle?" And I'm thinking to myself, "No shit, I got a PhD." The arrogance of youth.
Now you're talking my language.
Well, I didn't say that to my new boss, but I said, "Yes, I'm familiar with the perfect shuffle." So he said, "Well, read this article and see what you think about it." Well, it turns out in a binary computer, in a digital computer, there are basically two things you can do with numbers. You can multiply by 2 and you can add 1. And that's it. You can't do anything else. With decimal numbers, you can essentially multiply by any number from up to 10. Think of it as multiplying by 1 through 10 or 0 through 9. And you can add, again, it's basically one number to it. And you can just, if I wanted to add 7 to it, I just 7 times that add 1 to it. So what a parallel processor is imagine that you've got a half a dozen laptop computers, and you've got them sitting on your dining room table or the kitchen counter. And now you're going to connect them together so that at various times I can take the data that's in computer 3 and I can move it to computer 7. And I take the data in computer 7, I move it to computer 2, and then each computer was now going to start working on its piece of data. And then after a while, you're going to shift. And so if you're clever, you can take a big problem, chop it up into little bitty pieces, and you can then have several very small computers work on a little bitty piece.
Hmm.
And they occasionally will exchange the data. So that the data Jim was working on, he finishes with it, and I finish with my data, and we're going to swap. Or Jim gives me his data, and I give mine to John, and John gives his to his wife, and there's an exchange that occurs. Then we go back and work again. And what this lets us do is solve problems faster. Now, there's some problems that can't be chopped up into little pieces. To use very geeky terminology, it's not parallelizable. And if that's not geeky terminology, at least it's hard to pronounce. So there's some problems that are not parallelizable. But other problems can very easily and naturally be chopped up into little bitty pieces. And then you have, instead of these huge hulking computers, when I got started in the business, they really were huge and hulking. They're 6 feet tall and,
Yep.
massive. Now we're talking about telephone now. It has more compute power than the computers that they sent, guys to the moon with. So the idea is you're going to take this really hard, big problem and you break it into little bitty pieces. And you then can solve it quickly with small, cheap computers. Well, that's what we have now with chips. We build a chip. Whoever's got the best technology builds the chip. And then you chop your problem into little bitty pieces, and there you go. So I read the article and I said, "Oh." In fact, one of the tricks was the card trick that I knew. It was the Elmsley trick, where you can move the top card to any location in the deck by shuffling. And this guy was moving data around a computer memory by shuffling the memory.
Mhm.
Normally, a computer memory is on a disk. We don't use physical disks anymore. But when you had physical disks, the data was all in. It was like on a merry-go-round. And if I wanted to get someone off the merry-go-round, I would then rotate the merry-go-round until I got to the, drop-off place, wherever it is that people were going to get off. Maybe you had a stool there, so it'd be easier to step off of the merry-go-round. That's what a disk memory was. It was just a merry-go-round spinning around with data stored in these locations. What if we didn't spin in circles? What if we could do the equivalent of shuffling people? And so we had like slide chutes that went from one location on the merry-go-round to another location. So when it was time to rearrange, you didn't go around in a circle. You got on your chute and you slid down to the next location. And then everyone got on their chute at the same time and everyone slid at the same time. That's what's doing a perfect shuffle is basically that, a very precise way of moving around in the memory.
How you doing there, Jim?
Huh? I stopped, I gave up a long time ago.
I think most of our listeners did not. I think you got more of it than you
Yeah, I probably
realize.
did, but it's fascinating that you just there's things then there's things you don't know, and then there's things that you don't know that you don't know. I'm so far out of where of things I know that my mind is just constantly in turmoil up there. It's really something. This is the level of math and the level of thinking about math is so far beyond where I am as a human being that I can't help but find this absolutely incredible.
But Jim, you can picture a deck of cards,
Yes, I can
26 and
picture
26.
all of it.
Each one of it has a value, and you're just moving it up and down and around. And
Yeah, but then you get on a slide and you slide it down so you can get off the merry-go-round. My thought about how good people off the merry-go-round is just make it go very quickly. People will just fly off the merry-go-round. So this is really fascinating, but I am really having to run hard to keep up because it's so far. I just don't have that mind. I don't have a math mind.
all right, Brent, you've lived with math since ever, and you've explored all corners of it. Is that true? Are there people who just don't have a math mind, or is it just they haven't had a good teacher?
First, let me get to a very specific. Let's do a parallel. Someone says, I don't like novels because I can't read. And you can say, no, everybody can read, and you just put your mind to it, and you can enjoy a novel. Well, in fact, there is dyslexia. There's a mental processing problem that some people have, where symbols get scrambled in the process of going from their eyes to the brain. There's also a problem called dyscalculia. And these are people that have trouble doing calculations. So let's put the dyscalculia people aside. Let's put the dyslexia people aside. And let's now go with what's mostly the broad world out there. And I think the problem is somewhere along the line, they had a math teacher that they didn't like, that embarrassed them in class, that they were trying to solve a problem that everyone else said, oh, I see how to do it. They're working on the problem. And then, their classmates are working on the problem, and they're stuck with it. And they're embarrassed to say that they're stuck with it. And then they get a bad grade, and they're embarrassed because they're in the bad grade. And they're put the next year they're put in the slow learners class, and they say the sooner I get out of math, the better. Now, when I got out of grad school, or when I was in grad school at Duke, and so this is 71 to 74, one of the questions was, why are there not more women majoring in mathematics? Mathematics was one of the majors. Well, in fact, there were women's majors and there were men's majors, and men majored in science and technology, women majored in literature and in the arts. And I remember that the initial thought was something's going wrong in the freshman year. What can we do to change the freshman experience to get more women involved in majors? And as they did the research, they discovered that hypothesis was wrong, that the problem can be traced back to the 7th or 8th grade. So that's when you made this very important bifurcation. You took one of two paths, and you either you were going to take algebra, or if you didn't take algebra, you were going to take business math, and you were going to learn how to do spreadsheets and that type of math. And when you get to your freshman in college, you really can't do the math you need in college is calculus. When I was in school, calculus was the fundamental skill you needed for physics, for engineering, for chemistry. To move forward in math, you had to have calculus. To have calculus, you had to have analytic geometry. To have analytic geometry, you had to have advanced algebra. To have advanced algebra, you had to have, and then you work your way back, and all of a sudden you realize that everything you want to do as a freshman depends on the decision you made in the 6th grade or the 5th grade. When am I going to go into pre-algebra or am I going to go into business math?
Mhm.
And that, I thought that was an interesting discovery that here everyone is thinking, we've got to do something to change the freshman curriculum. And the answer is no. You've got to change the 5th grade curriculum if you want more women majoring in STEM. STEM, of course, is a or modern acronym or whatever that's called. And think about how many special programs for girls in STEM topics that you see today. And I think this is just wonderful. This is a group that has been excluded from participating in math because it's not a girl's activity. And now they're saying, no, STEM is important. We want to show girls in elementary school how exciting STEM can be. In fact, there was just within the last year, 2 young women came up with a new proof for one of Pythagoras's problems. This problem had been sitting around for 2,400 years, give or take, and no one had looked at it quite the right way. Well, these 2 young women looked at it the right way, and they said, wait a minute, if you do it like this, you can solve the problem. And there is this, face-smacking OMG moment when the math community says, they're right, they did it.
So I put it to you, Jim, that if you'd had Brent as a math teacher in 5th or 6th grade, you would have long ago solved Fermat's theorem, and you would be making your living
I'm
as a mathematician.
sure that's true. The aha moment for me is, yes, it probably started that early. That it was probably in the 4th or 5th grade that it became difficult for me. Once it became difficult, then it became impossible shortly thereafter. Once it became, I can't understand this, then that became a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. I don't like this because I can't explain it. However, if you want me to read something and tell you, give you my analysis of what I just read, that I can do and love to do, and I'm happy to do. Or if you want me to stand up in front of the class and do something, that I can do. And there are people in my class who can't do that. And so that is the branching. It's happens much earlier than that's what's fascinating to me is that just lit that up for me. It's like, yes, it was somewhere 3rd, 4th, 5th grade that I made choices that led me to where I'm sitting rather than where Brent is sitting. But I wonder how much of that is in the teacher's hands and how much of it belongs to the way my mind works. So is there a correlation between what I enjoy and how my mind works and what I'm not good at and how my mind works?
You're asking what's almost a philosophical question.
Ah.
Uh, did you get, here's the interesting thing with me and my sister. I saw Buffalo Bob, blew my mind away. I started studying magic. I get the positive feedback, getting a nickel a head for people sitting in the audience to watch the show. My sister, we grew up in Texas. She fell in love with horses. She has raised horses. She's bred horses. She could not imagine going through life without having a barn behind her house with a horse in it. For some reason, horses never caught on with me, not the way magic did. And it's hard to pinpoint what's going to have that positive feedback to the young mind. Now, I do think there is a difference, not the dyslexia, non-dyslexia difference, or the dyscalculia, non-dyscalculia. But there's a difference in the way people learn, in what is easy for them, what they're good at. But there's not a massive difference. Everyone ought to be able to balance a checkbook. Everyone ought to be able to read a menu and or read directions. If you don't have a problem like dyslexia or something, there's some minimum levels that everyone can do, and then there's some people that can do better with mental arithmetic, than others. But I don't think there's a massive difference. Such a difference that people say I can't do math. Well, it probably means that you had early in your career a bad experience with a teacher, and you said, "I'm not getting any positive feedback from this course. I'm going to focus on courses where I do get positive feedback."
I'll buy that. I really would buy that as and it's fascinating to me to think about it that way, that it has more to do with where the positive feedback came, rather than I'm incapable of doing that, which has been my supposition for these many years. I'm incapable of doing that. That's not something that I do or can do. This is what I can do, and it has a lot to do with where I got positive feedback.
Now, the one thing I worry about saying that is that there is someone, there's an education professional, a doctor of education, who has studied the data and said, "Morris, you may do good card tricks, but you don't know anything about learning. You don't know anything about the way the human brain is wired." I'm just saying what makes common sense to me, that we all are attracted to things that give us positive feedback. Everyone likes positive feedback, and so for whatever reason, that's what we stick with.
It makes perfect sense.
Yeah,
I don't think you need a huge study to prove that. I think you're right. It is common sense.
I just proved it. My dogs had to go out. They had to come back in, and they want their treat. They got their positive feedback for that.
there you go, positive feedback.
Somebody had once in a while given me a treat while I was in algebra class. Who knows where I'd be today?
Cunningham, here's a cookie. Yeah, that's all you really needed. Okay, we've taken a lot of your time. Let's steer back to magic just to wrap this up. What role does magic play in your life now, and what excites you about magic?
I almost never leave the house without a deck of cards in my breast pocket. It's not 100%, and I'm always say, "Darn, I should have had a deck of cards." But it's 90% of the time I have a deck of cards in my pocket, because someone will say, "Oh, you may not know it, but Brent's a magician," or "Brent was the first person to get his PhD in card shuffling." Well, it really wasn't in card shuffling. It was in the mathematics of random. I was looking at permutation groups. But since I was looking at permutation groups associated with shuffling playing cards, I call it a PhD in card shuffling. And they say, "Card shuffling? What do you mean?" I said, "Well, let me show you." And I reach in my pocket and I pull out a deck of cards, and there's almost a gasp. I mean, a deck of cards is not a particularly unusual item.
Mhm.
It's just you don't expect it, a gentleman to carry it in his breast pocket. And then I can do a magic trick, blam, right on the spot. I've got 2 or 3 that I can do quickly, and, it's always fun to entertain, and, you meet a new friend, you go out for dinner, you do a quick trick or 2, it's an icebreaker for me. I get positive feedback from the table. People remember me as, "You're the guy that does the card tricks." So today, I nearly always carry a deck of cards with me. I'm prepared to do 2 or 3 tricks. I always much rather stop 1 trick short of the audience's capacity, so that everyone leaves the performance thinking, "Oh, I wish he had done 1 more trick," than to cross the line and have them think to themselves, "Oh, dear Lord, when is he ever going to stop doing this?"
That right there is something that a lot of professional entertainers have not tumbled to yet, myself included. That
Yeah.
idea, we always say, leave them wanting more. It is just seldom am I capable of that, but it's a really smart thing, which doesn't surprise me that you have tumbled to, because you're a very smart guy.
Thank you very much.
I'm not sure how to phrase this, but what are some misconceptions people, my name Jim could be inserted in there, have about magic and mathematics? Misconceptions about those two things.
First thing is they're surprised that you can actually do a pretty good card trick with some pretty sophisticated mathematics. They're surprised that both the entertainment value and the mathematical value are as high as they are. They're expecting that, oh, he's doing something like subtracting 2 from the location of the card in his head. So the card is position 17, and he subtracts 2 from 17 and gets 15, and that's the level of the mathematics and in the card trade. So the surprise is it's really pretty good magic, and it's really decent math.
So, am I wrong in thinking that a magician who is really good at memorized deck and really good at a pharaoh shuffle would be burned at the stake for the tricks you'd be able to do if you walking in knew where every card was and then were able to shuffle to that?
There are many breathtaking tricks that you can do with it's a memorized deck or a stacked deck. And if you add to that with a pharaoh shuffle that I can then do, turns out with a deck of 52 cards, 8 out shuffles returns the deck to its original order. 8 out shuffles is a lot of out shuffles to do.
Yeah.
But let's say I did 5 in advance before I came to the show, and then I can casually spread the cards and they look almost mixed up. If you look at after 5 shuffles, there are some patterns that are starting to emerge. But I bring out the deck of cards, I do a perfect shuffle, I chat with someone, I do another perfect shuffle, and I say, let me show you a trick that I learned. And then I do that third perfect shuffle, and now the deck has had 5 from the setup. So now we're good to go. So one of the things that I did, there's a David Burgess has this amazing trick. It's called any card at any number, ACAN. It's abbreviated ACAN. The trick is basically simple. You bring out a deck of cards and you say, you, sir, name a card. You, ma'am, name a number from 1 to 52. And so Jack of Hearts, 27. And you count down to 27, and there's the Jack of Hearts. He's famous for having done that. People ask me all the time, could you do that with pharaoh shuffles? Well, I figured out how to do it. It requires 6 perfect pharaoh shuffles in a row. That's well beyond the limit of a normal audience because a pharaoh shuffle takes 10 to 30 seconds to do because you butt the cards together, you get them cut just exactly right. In my case, I'm old enough that I've had cataract surgery, so I have a little trouble seeing close up. And so it's hard for me to use, visual estimation to cut the cards. The first time I performed this in public was at Queen Mary's College at the University of London. I'd been invited over to give a talk, and the presentation is on YouTube.
There'll be a link in the show notes.
I will watch that.
Yeah, and I said, this is something that I've never tried before, but I'm going to take a risk. And I said, name a card, name a location. I did my 6 shuffles. I counted down to the location. I turned it over, and there is the Jack of Hearts, the 3 of clubs, or whatever. Oh, wow. And I get polite applause. And then what I like about my method, I said, I figured as long as I was going to go to the trouble of getting the Jack of Hearts to position 27, that I might as well reset the entire deck to new deck order. And at that point, I turned the deck over, spread it out on the table. It's ace to king, ace to king, ace to king. Actually, I'm lying. It's not new deck order. But if you don't know what new deck order is, it's ace to king, ace to king, ace to king, where it's actually ace to king, king to ace, king to ace. But that is one of the things that makes any magic trick, not just a card trick, this surprise kicker at the end.
Mhm.
Yes, I've cut the woman in half, and then what happens next? She's restored, and now the costume she's wearing has 2 different colors to it. It is that unexpected kicker, and that unexpected kicker to my version of ACAN. Yes, you got to endure 6 perfect shuffles. Oh, and by the way, I decided to reset the deck. I turned it over and spread it out, and there are gasps because they didn't expect it at all. It happened in front of them while they were watching me do whatever it was I was to get the chosen card to the location, and then blammo, there's the deck restored.
Yeah.
That to me, I think, makes powerful entertainment.
What an amazing guy. And I'm so glad we stumbled upon Brent. He actually stumbled upon us, and then I sort of begged him to come on and talk about what he does.
When we say we
mean me. Yeah,
we mean
I know.
you.
You're not in that
No,
loop.
no,
I like
no.
to surprise you.
I'm watching the fuel gauge and making sure that wings are level, but in terms of where we're going or the pre-flight check, that's not me.
So to reassure the passengers, if I were to fall unconscious, can you land this plane?
We'd circle for a while, I would think, and
Uh,
if you if just so you know, if you do pass out, the chances of me giving you mouth to mouth are very slim. I couldn't get there in time. We'd have
Yeah.
to, we're in two completely different locations. So please maintain the cabin pressure. That's
And we're
all.
going to do our best. In reviewing what we discussed with Brent, I realized that as far as we know, and again, this is as far as we know, Brent is our first guest with a background at the NSA,
Yeah,
as far as we know.
as far as we know, that's
Yeah.
correct. We don't know. But how cool is that?
So if we go down the list of people we've talked to, who else might have been an NSA agent? David Regal, possibly. Silly Billy, you bet.
We don't know.
Carissa Hendricks, yeah, I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure. Despite all the other fascinating things he talked about, for me, the discussion about negative experiences with teachers turning you off to
Amen.
things.
Yep.
Uh,
That was the whole deal for me. As I listened back, that was revelatory when we interviewed him, and it struck me even harder in
Mhm.
listening to it that
Mhm.
yes, indeed, those things, your path is charted at an early age, much earlier than you think.
yeah.
That to me was fascinating.
Yeah. You kind of want to hit the way back button and go back and, you know, say to Sister Cecilia, if you weren't so mean to us, some of us might have been more successful.
Well, it is what it is, I guess, and yeah, I am very happy with how things turned out for me. I wish I was a little better at math than I am, but I'm willing to sacrifice that because there are people that can do that, and I can find them.
I
Um,
suppose so. I suppose so. But let me ask you this, Mr. Part-Time Magician. Did you ever do any memorized deck work?
no, no,
Have
no,
you ever played with Pharaoh shuffles?
no, no.
But you were around them.
Yep. I'm around them. I've seen them. I admire them. Uh, to me, and this could just be me, and I don't mean to disparage at all because I have a great respect for anybody who can do anything that I can't do, essentially, including a Pharaoh shuffle. But it seems the because I'm such a schlep or an everyman in most situations that I perform, having that level of expertise would,
Oh.
kind
Yeah.
of run counter to my brand.
Yep.
And so I've never really explored it because it would seem suddenly there's things that, and/or I'm lazy. That's the real reason. But the large rationalization is it would run counter to my brand, which I think is also equally true. Um, and I wonder in a discussion with one of our guests, but not on the podcast, I don't think, but David Parr, even if you don't know what the magician did, if you know when he did it,
Mhm.
or you smell something fishy, that undermines the magical experience, in my opinion.
Mhm.
So I wonder if the Pharaoh shuffle is so locked down, and I think there's a swath of an audience who's going to go, "What the heck what did he just do? I don't even know what
Right.
that is."
Right.
That in a card sharp's hands, in Brett's hands, I'm sure it all makes sense, but in my hands, it would make no sense at all, and my audience would go, Well, he's cheating somehow."
Right. So you're in the middle there, and on the other end of that would be like Danny Ortiz or Leonard Green, where they look at him and go, "That guy has no idea what he's doing. Those
Right,
cards are a mess.
right,
Should he even be doing this
right,
professionally?"
right, right.
Yeah. Okay.
Fascinating, no, and just so sharp, such a sharp guy to talk to. It's so much fun for me, who am, admittedly, this is not my area. I'm in I'm in over my head almost immediately with this conversation, but so fascinating to hear a guy, and this is the podcast in general is like this for me. I, I, Talking to smart people about things they're passionate about is phenomenally enjoyable for
Mhm.
me. I
Yeah.
don't maybe the listeners are like, I know, you're wrong about that. But for me, talking to a smart person about something they really understand and are passionate about, even if I don't know the first thing about it, like I didn't hear,
Mhm.
it was fascinating.
Well, I agree. It was a little off our beaten track, but certainly heading us in the correct direction. We have more of that coming up this season, just because these things happen serendipitously, and we love it when that happens. And
Yeah.
speaking of things that we love,
Da da da. Nice one.
thank you.
Nice. Very nice. Who
This
starts? Is it
you
me?
start. You start. This is an odd episode, so you start.
Okay. So I have a trip coming up to Europe with my lovely wife. We've never been to Italy. We've been to the British Isles several times, but never to Italy. And I am, yes?
If I can interrupt for just a second, because you're going to Italy. This is being recorded before you're going to Italy, but people will hear it after,
Huh.
just so they understand the context of
Yeah,
how we're doing these things.
yeah, and
As you're
we
going away, we're doing this early, and you're hearing. So Jim will have already come back by the time you hear this. But anyway,
we
you
hope,
2 are headed.
God willing.
Yeah,
We don't know.
or we'll have
Uh,
an in memoriam section at the end of
Yes,
this one.
exactly. And so, not knowing anything about, you can buy the guidebooks, and we did,
Mhm.
but we've spent a lot of time researching the each of the cities we're going to visit and what to do and how to get around. And a guy that we stumbled on, or a website that we stumbled on that we really love, is called
Mhm.
thetourguy.com.
Rome is spectacular. Of course, you'll see the Colosseum, the Vatican, and St. Peter's Basilica. But what about everything else? On foot, you'll melt in the Roman heat. Hop on, hop off buses? Too slow. Private cars? Too big. The real Rome is in the ancient alleyways, quiet piazzas, and hidden cafes, and tour buses don't go there.
And there's a lot of Italian cities, but he also has London and Barcelona, and so he's charming, he's funny, he's practical. He gives you tips on how to get around, where to eat, and what to see, and how to book a tour, and how to book. And he's my tip, if you're going in that direction and you're thinking to yourself, like we did, we don't speak the language, the money is different,
Mhm.
how are we gonna, this guy made it very, very easy and approachable in terms of his ability to keep us calm and keep us from freaking out, knowing we're going to be in a country that doesn't speak our language for 2 weeks. Now, yeah, a lot of them speak English because, that's who we are. We're America, and you better come around because we're not going to come around to you. You're going to have to make your peace with the fact that we're not learning your language, so learn ours. But and so there's predominantly we'll be okay in that area. But it was just super helpful to stumble on this guy and have him say, okay, here are things you need to know. The lines are going to be extraordinary. If you
Mhm.
don't book in advance, if you don't get a skip the line ticket, if you don't book a tour, your whole vacation is going to be spent standing in line outside the Sistine Chapel
Mhm.
or standing in line to get a gondola ride. Here are ways to avoid those things. And so I really can't recommend him highly enough if you're planning a trip over there to that part of the world. He's delightful.
And it
And
is thetourguide.com. I'll put a
yeah,
link in the show notes.
thetourguy.com.
And I will just echo that by saying, if you're going to travel anywhere where you're not familiar, go to YouTube.
Yeah.
Tour guy might have what you want, but also find 4 or 5 other videos that people have done. I did that when I went to Edinburgh.
Yep.
When I stepped off the plane, I knew exactly where I was and what I was doing because I'd watched 5 or 6 videos. And you want to watch more than one because people have different experiences, but you get a sense of, oh, here's the big issues. Here's the issue with the money. Here's the issue with the subway. You figure that stuff out ahead of time. And
Right.
as always, if you can, book any tours you're going to do ahead of time.
I
Because
agree.
otherwise you spend your whole day trying to get the tour booked and it's no fun. Well, that's fabulous. I'm going to be a little overseasy as well in my I love that.
And we didn't plan this, folks. We never
nope,
do.
it
We
just
don't
happened.
talk about this.
It just happened. Couple episodes again. Your I love that was the Rise sleep aid app,
Yeah.
which I downloaded and punched everything in, and the app basically said to me, "Yeah, you're doing everything fine." It said you should be going to bed this time. You should be getting up that time, and that was exactly what I was already doing. So that was, although interesting, not something I needed. But I will say to those of us who might have trouble falling asleep right away, there is, I've mentioned listening to Stephen Fry reading Sherlock Holmes, which is always delightful. But there's a thing called the shipping news, and anyone from the UK will know what it is. It's a portion of the BBC radio at the end of the day for about 12 minutes. They read, different announcers read that day's shipping news. And it is lulling and calming and relaxing. And it'll put you out because it sounds just like this.
Another shipping forecast issued by the Met Office at 2343 on Saturday the 18th. There are warnings of gales in all areas except Trafalgar. The general synopsis at 1800, low 200 miles south of Iceland 960, drifting slowly east and filling. Low 250 miles northeast of the Faroes 956.
It's often different announcers, but it is half the words you don't understand. You don't know how anyone who was in the shipping business could gather any information from this. But it'll put you right out, and I don't mean that in a negative way. It is. I'm not the only one. There are, I'll put a link to at least one in the show notes. There are people who've assembled 5, 6, 8 hours of shipping news broadcasts in one continuous file. So you can turn it on at any point and go to sleep, and you'll hear
5 to 7, occasionally gale 8. Rain, then showers, moderate or good. Fisher, southwesterly, veering westerly, 6 to gale 8, perhaps severe gale 9 later. Rain, then wintry
and
showers,
you will just gently fall
moderate
asleep.
or poor, because
So-
I had to
good.
wake up
German
just to
bites
do the finish
hover.
the podcast.
Yeah.
That's
Southwesterly, veering
fantastic.
Anyway.
I love this
Severe gale
podcast
9,
so
decreasing
much.
Anyway,
That made me very
for
happy.
anyone who is still awake, last time, Jim, you read chapter 8. Chapter 8.
So before I jump into chapter 9, which is right around the corner here, just recap chapter 8 for everybody.
Sure. Let me see. Let me remember what happened at 8. Eli and Megan are staying at Lawrence Baxter's house. We do some stuff about breakfast. We meet the young maid, Gwendolyn. They talk about how they're going to fill the nights at the magic circle that they need to fill. They talk about whether or not Jake should be allowed to do the inaugural presentation of DeVries' new device, the Catherine wheel. They talk about Archie Banks and how he stole from all of them 30 years before. And the conversation interrupted when Lawrence Baxter comes into the room and says that one of their number, Boris, is dead. And that takes us right into chapter 9.
Chapter 9. I thought it would be tough to make Lawrence Baxter's large house feel crowded, but the police accomplished that feat in record time. What started with a call to the British equivalent of 911 and the arrival of their version of EMTs blossomed quickly into a full-blown police investigation. I recognized a couple of faces from the team that had been on hand at the Magic Circle, including Detective Inspector Matthews, with whom I'd had a frustrating conversation about Harry's connection to the death of Oscar. That seemed like a very long time ago, although it occurred to me it had only been 3 days, and not even 3 full days at that. After Baxter's announcement of Boris's death, a quiet dread fell over the usually voluble group. So by the time the full contingent of police had arrived, most of us were still seated. Angus Bishop had disappeared into the hallway a few times to press Baxter for more details, each time returning with a morsel or two. The first piece of information was that Boris had been discovered when one of the maids, young Gwendolyn, who had helped at breakfast, entered his room to make up the bed and discovered a corpse in it. The second was the EMT's suggestion that based on their review of the body and the level of rigor, the cause of death may have been poison. The third was that the police were concurring with this initial assessment. Although they continually refilled our coffee cups, our plates had been silently carried away by the household staff, who I could hear whispering away in the kitchen. They were silenced immediately upon the appearance of Miss Hess, who moved slowly and ominously through the dining room and into the kitchen, the swinging door making more noise than she had. A verbal exchange of some kind took place on the other side of the door, but all I could hear were muffled female voices, and then the hiss of Miss Hess as she said loudly, "Second girl, you come now." A few moments later, she returned from the now silent kitchen, ushering Gwendolyn in front of her. The young girl looked pale and shaken. Hess and her charge passed Angus on their way out of the dining room. He turned and waited until they were out of earshot before turning back to the group. "They're questioning the staff to see if anyone brought Boris any food or drink last night," he said. "But the consensus seems to be it's likely something he had before he retired to his room. Which means it could have been something we all had as well," Roy Templeton offered. "Except none of us is dead," Roxanne said. "Declining, yes. Dead, no," Roy agreed. "The tea," Davis DeVries said suddenly. "Wasn't he the only one to drink tea last night?" He looked around the table, and we all agreed, but Angus shook his head. "He brought his own tea. Always did," he said. "No way to get poison into his tea." "But he didn't bring his own hot water," DeVries countered. "And no one else used it, right?" "He offered me some tea," I said, "but I didn't have any. I'm not a big tea drinker," I added, in case my refusal of the tea would somehow indicate some hidden involvement in the crime. "Hence, they're talking to the staff," DeVries concluded, as if the matter had been settled. Turns out, it wasn't as settled as he thought it was. A few moments later, they started pulling each of us out of the dining room for individual interviews. Detective Inspector Matthews began her questioning of me by assuring me this was all routine. "Really?" I said. "Two magicians dead in 72 hours, both probably murdered. That's routine?" "The situation is abnormal," she said, her mixed English and Indian accent having lost none of its charm. "It is the act of questioning which is routine." I couldn't argue with that, and so I answered her questions as fully as I could, recapping the previous day's events. Particular emphasis was placed on the late-night drinking session in Lawrence Baxter's den, where I was asked to recount, to the best of my ability, everything that had been said or done while I was in the room. My strongest memory of the evening's session had been the inadvertent discovery of Jake North performing my card routine on a late-night chat show. The rest of the details were fuzzy. I related my version of who was drinking what, the arrival of the hot water for Boris's tea, his offer to share said tea, and my polite refusal. As for the particulars of the conversations that didn't concern Jake North's thievery, I had to admit I was a bit fuzzy. There was a long discussion about which magician was the fastest at calculating the numbers for the magic square, I offered. I could tell from her expression that more explanation was required. "It's a popular magic trick that requires some quick arithmetic," I added for clarification. And was a consensus reached, she asked, about the maths and who was the best? I shook my head. Hardly. A consensus is a difficult thing to come by with magicians, I explained. A few of the guys lobbied hard for a magician named Richard Lee. Everyone else was split, often along national lines. Then, as is often the case, the conversation drifted into other topics. You see, late-night conversations with magicians are always similar and tend to revolve around the same subjects, I continued. It's always about a new technique that is either much better or much worse than an old technique, with heated arguments on either side, or it's about a particularly heinous gig or booker or green room or stage setup, or an audience member who confounded every out we have for a particular routine, or what we would have said in a certain situation, but we didn't want to lose the gig. I stopped and took a breath, realizing that despite the length of my list, I had neglected a number of recurring subtopics. Some of the specifics change, but that's the general outline of every conversation with a group of magicians. Yes, well, it is the specifics that interest us this morning, Detective Inspector Matthews said quietly. Tell me, what are the dynamics of the group? The dynamics? Who's in charge? Who likes who? Who bears a grudge? Well, they all bear grudges, I said with a wry laugh. They're performers. Her expression suggested I dig deeper, so I thought about the people assembled in the room the previous evening. Well, obviously, Lawrence Baxter is the most successful, I began, gesturing around the room, which appeared to be one of an abundance of small sitting rooms. If I had the number of closets in my apartment that Baxter had sitting rooms, I'd be a happy renter. I mean, I said, of the original group, he's the one who really hit it big. The original group? She asked, consulting her notes. The Magnificent Magi, I explained. They all started around the same time, helped each other get started, competed for gigs. They all wear the same ring, I added, helpfully gesturing at my hand for some reason, even though I don't wear a ring. And they were all assembled here last night? I think so, I said, trying to remember the photo Lawrence Baxter had pointed out at the Magic Circle. I mean, obviously, Oscar Corhonen wasn't here. Obviously, she agreed. And there was at least one other member, I continued, trying to remember the name. But he died, I guess, years ago. Do you know the circumstances? Archie Banks, I said, a little too loudly, pleased my memory had finally kicked in. His name was Archie Banks, and they said he died of suicide. No, that's not the right way to put it. He was a suicide. He killed himself, I finally said, glad to have gotten that all sorted out. Archie Banks. Suicide, she repeated, as she added to the page of notes I had helped her generate. Yeah, he stole a lot of magic routines from all of them and then killed himself, I said, watching as she scribbled down my words. She looked up at me. He stole from them, and then he killed himself, she repeated. Yes, I said, thinking back on Harry's explanation of the event. But I believe at the time it was felt he was only making an attempt at suicide and had really not wanted to kill himself. Apparently, he attempted suicide a lot. It was sort of a thing with him. She looked up from her notes, waiting to see if I had anything useful to add to the story. At least, that's what they told me, I finally said. All right then, she said as she closed her notebook. Let's see what they have to tell me. When I returned from my interview with Detective Inspector Matthews, I found that most of the dining room's earlier occupants had been moved to different areas in the house for their own bouts of questioning. I was surprised Uncle Harry had finished his interview before I had, and even more surprised to see he was sharing a cup of coffee with his old friend, Henry McHugh. How did it go? Harry asked as I entered. He pushed a new coffee cup across the table toward me as I returned to my original seat. I was just going to ask you that, I said, reaching for the coffee urn. It was nearly empty, but I poured what was left into my cup. I nodded a greeting at McHugh as I poured, and he gave me a welcoming nod in return.
A friend in the service alerted me to the situation, he said. I thought I might be able to lend a hand, or an idea. I was just telling McHugh that their questioning of me seemed at best perfunctory, Harry said. He suggested a longer, more in-depth interview is in my not-too-distant future. That would be the traditional approach, McHugh agreed.
He was dressed in the same tweed jacket I'd seen him in before, and his trilby hat was in its apparent permanent position on his head.
Harry is still their key suspect from the murder this past weekend. So they will note your reaction at this new interview, and then compare and contrast how you behave after you've had some time to sort yourself out. And what about you?
He said, turning back to me. Before I could offer reflections on my interview, Lawrence Baxter entered, escorting Megan. He pulled out a chair for her by force of habit, but he was clearly distracted.
"This is a morning I could have done without," he said.
And no one expects to wake up with a corpse as a house guest, McHugh agreed.
"Well, clearly someone did," Baxter said.
He stopped, surprised to see this new figure in his dining room, and then seemed to wave it off as all part of the surreal morning he was having. He reached for the coffee urn and cursed quietly when he recognized that it was empty. He carried it to the swinging kitchen door.
"Can we have some more coffee, please?"
he said, holding up the empty urn as physical evidence of his displeasure at the current state of household affairs. He waited for a moment, then turned back, looking exasperated.
"No one there. Of course, they're all being questioned. I suppose I'll have to make it myself."
Baxter stomped into the kitchen, and we could hear him banging around as he began what appeared to be, for him at least, the arduous process of making coffee.
If he gets this upset over a lack of coffee, how is he likely to react when we tell him the cream pitcher is empty?
McHugh suggested with a smile.
Everyone reacts to stress differently, Harry said quietly. He's got to deal with all the special shows this week at the Magic Circle, a house full of bothersome guests, and now a dead body and a police invasion. I think he's allowed a tiny crack in his famous British Reserve. Yes, a murder investigation is always an interruption to even the best-planned garden party,
McHugh agreed. He turned to me, leaning across the table and lowering his voice.
So, tell me about the tea.
As I had done with Detective Inspector Matthews, I explained how Gwendolyn had brought in the tea service accompanied by Miss Hess, and how Boris had offered me some tea. McHugh asked a couple of questions about the timing of the delivery and the exact location of each person in the room, and then sat back and considered what I had recounted.
If the poison was in the kettle, it could have been added at any point after the afternoon tea, he said slowly. So, basically, anyone could have put the poison in the kettle at any point during the evening. If, in fact, that was how the poison was delivered, Harry offered,
and McHugh nodded in agreement.
And if what you told me is correct, McHugh said, turning to Harry, the odds are quite good Boris would be the only one in the group who would drink tea last evening. Is that correct?
Harry nodded.
Yes, given the choice between Baxter's high-end liquor cabinet and tea, this group could be counted on to always choose free booze. Except for you two, McHugh said, pointing at me and then at Megan. Someone may have had prior knowledge of Boris's habit, but you two were both unknowns in that regard.
I would have taken tea if it was offered, Megan said, but Roxanne dragged me off to a room for girl chat. And alcohol. Too much alcohol, she added. slowly rubbing her temples with her forefingers. I looked over at the kitchen to see if Baxter had made any progress with the coffee.
What about you, Eli? McHugh asked. Are you a tea drinker?
If you'd asked me a couple of years ago, I would have emphatically said no, but Megan has introduced me to the pleasures of a warm cup of Earl Grey. I turned to her, and despite her headache, she flashed me a smile. However, Angus made such a strong argument against the tea last night, I decided to give it a pass.
Did he?
McHugh said thoughtfully.
Interesting. Not. A wise and fortuitous move on your part,
Harry said gravely. He looked to McHugh for agreement, but his old friend had settled back into his chair and was stroking the first of his several chins.
This is so odd,
I said, to fill in the silence. With the first slaying at the magic circle, the murderer was well aware his victim would be one of two people, Harry or Oscar. Did he care which one? We don't know. Was the wrong person killed? Again, we don't know. But the intended victim last night had to be Boris, I continued. He was the only one who was sure to drink the tea. There was always the chance Megan and I might have had some tea as well, but Boris was, for lack of a better term, a sure thing.
I think that is very likely correct, McHugh said. There was always the likelihood of collateral damage, he added. But I think it's clear Boris was the one who was scheduled to die.
What does that mean? I asked as Lawrence Baxter banged into the dining room, returning with the coffee.
I can't speak to the quality, he said, holding up the urn triumphantly, but here's the blasted coffee.
McHugh was the first to hold up his empty cup. He turned to me as he did.
What does it mean? He repeated.
I have no idea.
Let us have some more coffee and consider a few possibilities.
The conclusion of the questioning of guests and the household staff finally arrived about an hour later and coincided with the removal of Boris's body. While the staff had returned to the business of running the large house, the rest of us had wandered into the front foyer to stretch our legs and determine what to do next. The low, somber hubbub of the group came to a sudden stop with the appearance of two EMTs at the top of the stairs, carrying a stretcher between them. Boris's body was encased in a black plastic carrier. All that was discernible was a small, inert shape encased within a terminal sleeping bag. We all stood in respectful silence as they made their way down the stairs and passed us toward the front door. Hector Herchizo made a quick sign of the cross as they moved by him, and McHugh took off his hat. I noticed both Roxanne and Megan were visibly crying, and even Angus Bishop wiped his eyes with a handkerchief, which then disappeared immediately into his pocket.
You think of the strangest things at a time like this, Harry said quietly. I'd always meant to ask Boris about the center tear he'd developed. It was remarkable. Never get the chance now, I guess.
Aye, that secret dies with him, Angus agreed quietly. He was normally so upbeat and talkative, it was interesting to see this more subdued side of the glib old magician. Yeah, I said. I kept meaning to ask him to translate a Russian phrase I heard at the hotel we were at earlier this week. Never got around to it.
Not to worry. He likely wouldn't have been able to do it, Angus said. Boris wasn't Russian. He was Ukrainian. You mean Romanian, Lawrence Baxter corrected. Romanian, Ukrainian, same difference, Angus grumbled.
Detective Inspector Matthews had followed the grim procession down the stairs and watched closely through the open front door as the body was loaded into the coroner's van. She made a note of the time and then turned to the group, doing a quick head count to ensure we were all present and accounted for. "Thank you, all of you, for your cooperation this morning," she said in her clipped British-Indian hybrid accent. "As I mentioned to some of you, we may need to follow up at a later date
for a more in-depth conversation. I understand those of you who are not British residents are staying on for at least a few days?
Yes, Lawrence Baxter said, speaking for the group. We have a series of shows at the Magic Circle through Saturday, he said as he looked around the group. I'm guessing we will cancel tonight's show because of this most recent tragedy. But you're all staying on, correct?
See?
Said Hector. Absolutely, said Roxanne, and Roy nodded in agreement.
Where she goes, I go. Marriage is just long-term stalking, really,
he said brightly, and then realized humor might not be the best response in this situation. He quickly switched to a more appropriate, somber expression.
Of course, DeVries added. I can stay as long as required.
I've got nothing booked for a fortnight, Angus Bishop said. Maybe longer. Everyone turned to Harry.
Well, obviously, I'm not going anywhere,
Harry said quietly. The group reacted sympathetically, but there was a palpable feeling in the room, and there had been since the announcement of the discovery of Boris's body, that the group's built-in sense of unity was beginning to ebb. 2 members of the group were dead, and while no one had voiced any actual suspicion of Harry, I was getting the sense it was beginning to bubble up from under the surface. I scanned the lined faces of the magnificent magi assembled in the lobby. I knew Harry was not the killer. That line of thinking was a non-starter, which meant that if it was someone from within the group, they were standing with us right now. I suddenly realized, looking at all their unhappy faces, that they were all staring right back at me. I had forgotten we were all expressing our availability to Detective Inspector Matthews. I turned to her. "We're here for as long as you need us," I said. Baxter turned back to Detective Inspector Matthews.
"And of course, I'm at your disposal."
"All right then," she said. "We will be in touch." With that, she stepped through the door and Baxter closed it behind her. The group was still unusually quiet as he turned back to us. He sighed, clearly searching for the right thing to say at a time like this. However, as with the rest of us, Baxter wasn't really schooled for times like this.
"Well, that one plays things close to the vest, doesn't she?" Baxter said with a forced chuckle. "Hard to tell what she's thinking."
"Not at all. She is thinking someone in this house is a murderer."
We all jumped at the sound, looking around to see where it came from. It was the unmistakable voice of Miss Hess, who we discovered standing at the top of the stairs. She glowered down on the group, her gaze landing on each of us for a tad longer than we might have liked.
"And I, for one, am inclined to believe her,"
she added, before turning slowly and disappearing down the second-floor hall.
Hey, somebody in that house is a murderer, John.
Well, I tend to believe Miss Hess, who is not usually wrong about these things. You know, it's interesting when I was writing this book, I had wanted to open it with a quote from Teller, and of course, you ask for these things. It was an existing quote that he had, and so I emailed Tina Leonard, who's a friend, and she sent it on to Teller, and Teller wrote back. Anyway, Teller ended up reading the book when it was done.
That's nice.
And it was an amazing email to get saying, "Hey, I read the book. I enjoyed it. I thought the murderer was A. It turned out to be B." And so I've ridden on that for a while that I fooled Teller.
Well, tell her.
Yeah, I fooled Teller. And I don't really need full pen. I'm fine. I'm fine with that.
But yes, you've done your job. He is your Telemachus mentor. I forget which, but he's
Wow.
one of those two things.
Yes. Well, but I think our relationship changes depending on whether we're talking about mysteries or magic. So anyway, next time we're going to listen to chapter 10. We're also going to revisit some thoughts from Tyler Erickson. Now, you know, Tyler was just on recently with Star Newman, kind of guest starring on that one. But we're going to go back and listen to a couple of things he said in his original interview about how his teaching curriculum has evolved and his preference for close-up magic over stage performances. So we will do that and continue to talk to you guys about what we're going to do for season 6, if such exists.
Oh, come on now. Why
We'll
would you
see.
say that? We're having so much fun. How could we stop?
How could we ever stop? Anyway, that'll be next time, chapter 10, and a great snippet from our good pal, Tyler Erickson.
One of my teachers.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye, everybody. Be kind to each other, will you?
This has been Behind the Page, the Eli Marks podcast, with your hosts, John Gaspard and Jim Cunningham. Produced by Alberts Bridge Books at Grass Lake Studios. Find this podcast and all the books in the Eli Marks series at elimarksmysteries.com. That's ELIMARKS Mysteries.com. And thanks for listening.